When the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor, virtually every American was ready to take up arms to fight the Axis powers. However, black men, when attempting to join the fight with their fellow countrymen, found themselves barred from combat positions and excluded from the front lines. It was commonly believed that, when compared to white soldiers, blacks made inferior combatants and could not fight with similar levels of skill or of the same amount of courage. But one group of people challenged that opinion. They refused to accept defeat. They faced many obstacles from white Southerners, high-ranking officers, and enlisted men, but they were not deterred. They fought the increasingly powerful Nazis abroad and the oppressive discrimination at home. They proved that an African American could fly a fighter aircraft and excel at it, and proved through their bravery and skill that blacks can be every bit as courageous and as skilled as whites. The exploration of the abilities of African Americans in the Air Force through the Tuskegee Airmen and their encounters with the Axis forces during World War II caused an exchange in perspectives between servicemen of both races, and also prompted President Truman to issue Executive Order 9981, one of the first steps in desegregating America. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. The America of the 1930s was a very hostile and heavily discriminatory place for African Americans. A series of state and local rules called Jim Crow laws perpetuated the idea of separate but equal and segregated everything: bathrooms, libraries, movie theaters, buses, trains, water fountains, and schools. It was not any better in the military. In the 1930s, blacks only made up 2% of the army. This was influenced by studies by the War College. In 1925, they concluded that African Americans had a smaller cranial capacity compared to whites and were prone to crime. The War College also concluded that blacks were cowardly and superstitious. In the Navy, white sailors often refused to eat or live with black sailors. In 1919, the Navy stopped recruiting African Americans altogether. The still young Army Air Corps had no black pilots to speak of. Black aviators had their first breakthrough with the Civilian Pilot Training Program, or CPTP. The CPTP allowed African Americans to gain valuable flying experience that will help in the time to come. Most of the early Tuskegee Airmen took part in the CPTP. Many civil rights activists called for a squadron of black combat pilots. They believed blacks should be able to serve their country in all branches of the military. The decision to create and train black combat pilots to fight the Axis was ultimately signed off due to Eleanor Roosevelt's influence. In 1941, she asked to fly with one of the Tuskegee Airmen, giving the airmen the publicity boost and confidence they needed to move forward. However, many white officers had their doubts. They believed blacks lacked the intelligence and reflexes to not only fly, but to fight in complex fighter aircraft. The area selected for the training of black pilots was Tuskegee, Alabama. African Americans wishing to undergo pilot training were required to pay for the entirety of their time, while white pilots were paid $75 a month from the beginning of enrollment to the completion of their course.
The course was rigorous and very competitive. The best and brightest all over the nation flocked to Tuskegee. The first cadets were all college educated. Most cadets already knew how to fly because of the Civilian Pilot Training Program. Cadets who graduated were destined to fly fighter aircraft for the 332nd Fighter Group, composed of the 99th, 100th, 301st, and the 302nd Fighter Squadrons over Europe. While the Tuskegee Airmen were still in their infancy, the Axis powers seemed unstoppable. The war seemed hopeless, and the Tuskegee Airmen could not have come at a better time. The first of the squadrons, the 99th, deployed to North Africa in the spring of 1943, initiating the creation of the Tuskegee Airmen legend.
White officers were pressured by civil rights activists to explore the usage of African Americans in active combat for the first time in decades. While African American military men explored their own abilities in combat, the men were used in an experiment to see if blacks are physically, psychologically, and morally fit to serve in the air forces. The Tuskegee experiment also drew the attention of both the elites of the War College and the general population. By the war's end, they had passed with flying colors. Prior to the 99th Fighter Squadron, no black man in the United States Armed Forces had flown in combat. Dr. Daniel Hallman, chief of the Organizational Histories Branch at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, emphasizes that the Wright brothers invented the airplane in 1903, and the U.S. Army acquired its first airplane in 1909, but the U.S. military did not have any black pilots until 1942. Racial prejudice was the main reason. For decades, the U.S. Army did not consider blacks to be qualified to train to be military pilots. The inception of the Tuskegee Airmen marked the beginning of the destruction of this idea that blacks were too incompetent. When the Tuskegee Airmen were given the chance to prove themselves in combat, they performed extraordinarily well. On January 27, 1944, 16 P-40s of the 99th Fighter Squadron were patrolling over the Mediterranean when 15 German FW-190 fighters were spotted. The 99th jettisoned their fuel tanks and dove in. Immediately, the German fighters started dropping like flies. As Lieutenant Leon Roberts recalls his kill, "I was following a Jerry and was weaving along, but I got a burst into his right wing. He flopped over on his back and headed for the ground." That day, the 99th shot down 8 aircraft and scored 2 probable, while only losing 1 of their own. The 99th fought the feared Germans head-on and came out on top. At first glance, the 332nd Fighter Group's performance appears to be mediocre. After all, their air-to-air victory count was rather low compared to other fighter groups within the same time period. However, this was not caused from incompetence, but quite the opposite. The Tuskegee Airmen dutifully performed the job of escorting bombers and refrained from pursuing enemy fighters. Throughout the 332nd Fighter Group's span of deployment and combat overseas, out of 179 bomber escort missions, there were only 7 missions in which they lost any bombers. Their success overseas caused them to receive a lot of attention in newspapers back home in the United States. During and after the war, the Tuskegee Airmen were praised for their ability in combat. The Tuskegee Airmen proved to be beneficial to the military.
The battle to prove their worth was not an easy one for the Tuskegee Airmen, and they encountered discrimination against them due to their race in positions high and low, from their peers to high-ranking officers. However, the Tuskegee Airmen overcame these obstacles and triumphed over racism. For the majority of the year of 1942, the Tuskegee Airfield was run by Colonel Frederick von Kimball, who took measures to segregate the blacks from the whites. His immediate replacement, Colonel Noel Parrish, did the opposite and attempted to form bonds with his black soldiers. He lifted the ban on fraternization and remained in the officers' club even when his white colleagues refused to stay when blacks were allowed in. Furthermore, he took a supportive stance toward his black subordinates in conflicts with the white-dominated town of Tuskegee. When the war had ended, the Tuskegee Airmen described him as a good guy and certainly aided them in their training. After their training and arrival in North Africa, the Tuskegee Airmen were under the command of Colonel William M. Maumier. He constantly made attempts to remove the 99th from under his command. When he finally saw an opportunity to leave them in command of another leader, he seized it and ended up leaving an unfavorable note to higher authorities, citing poor performance and cowardice. When the airmen were stationed in Italy, they were under the command of Major General Edwin J. House. He received the message from Colonel Maumier and promptly wrote a memorandum suggesting for both the 99th Fighter Squadron and 332nd Fighter Group to be taken out of combat, and for all future black squadrons to be barred from ever entering combat. This suggestion was never put into effect, and the Tuskegee Airmen were able to go on to make history. On March 24th, 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen were escorting bombers to Berlin when they were intercepted by lightning-fast and heavily armed German jets like the Me-163 and the Me-262. The German jets could easily outrun the P-51s the Tuskegee Airmen flew, but by that time, the Tuskegee Airmen were battle-hardened veterans. Through skillful flying and tactics, the Tuskegee Airmen managed to shoot down 3 Me-262s in one day. By the end of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen had shot down a total of 112 aircraft. Many of the white bomber crews under their escort felt grateful for their presence in the air. As one white bomber crew said, their vigilant watch over us that day saved 10 of us from a potential tragedy. We, plus all of our families, will forever be grateful to them. The gratefulness of white B-17 crewmen under their watch was left unhindered by the fact that they had dark skin. Instead of receiving a hero's welcome like white veterans did, the Tuskegee Airmen seemed to be destined to be thrust back into a society whose racist feelings for them remained unchanged. Black veterans were given a similar treatment as to the one they received before the war. However, when President Truman caught wind of the prejudice against black veterans, he remarked to NAACP leader Walter White, "I had no idea things were as terrible as that. We've got to do something." He issued Executive Order 9981. Through Executive Order 9981, he formally integrated the U.S. Armed Forces and created a committee to oversee change. Through the efforts of black combat units, like the Tuskegee Airmen, segregation was being demolished in a major government institution. The Tuskegee Airmen themselves were awarded 2 Presidential Unit Citations, one of the highest decorations awarded in the U.S. Armed Forces. As the war finally drew to a close, the Tuskegee Airmen found themselves overcoming prejudice and becoming one of the most well-known combat units in the service of the United States of America.